Allow me to introduce Daniel Libeskind. Daniel was born in Łódź, Poland in 1946 and was a virtuoso musician at a young age before giving up music to become an architect. He received numerous awards and designed world-renowned projects, including the Jewish Museum in Berlin, the Denver Art Museum, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, the Military History Museum in Dresden, and the Master Plan for Ground Zero, among others. Daniel Libeskind's commitment to expanding the scope of architecture reflects his profound interest in involvement in philosophy, art, literature, and music. Fundamental to Daniel's philosophy is the notion that buildings are crafted with a perceptible human energy, and that they address the greater cultural context in which they are built. Daniel teaches and lectures at universities across the world, so please welcome architect Daniel Libeskind.
I just want to, good morning, Boker Tov. I was just trying to convince my wife Nina, who is much smarter than I am, to be up here to tell you something about architecture, but she refuses to come up. Come on. No, and I want to tell you why, because she's not only someone I love and who's my wife, and she's not the woman behind the man, but she walks alongside, and often the ideas that I pursue are ideas that she sort of has the temerity to address. So I don't think she is just some shadowy woman, sort of part of the family in my office, but she's a major factor in the buildings that I do. I think at Ground Zero, I would have never been able to complete that project without her political acumen. The Jewish Museum of Berlin would have never been built without Nina's involvement in the project. So I think she should come up here.
Well, some people would say that this could be grounds for divorce. But seeing as how we're about to celebrate 44 years of marriage, I guess I'll hang in there. If you allow me just to put this morning a little bit in context, for some reason, and I must apologize, and it's not a matter of who made the mistake, but Daniel understood he was going to be doing a master class and not a lecture. And rather than just doing another lecture, we thought that we could have a format on the stage where we would address just questions about architecture, because architecture is always about answering problems, and we thought perhaps today it would be about posing questions. So, you know, where does creativity come from? How does music and architecture relate? How do you get a project built, which is, I guess, why I'm here. And then perhaps we could throw it open to some of the people in the audience. We just put some slides on the screen that will be going every 5 seconds. And I don't know who begins the questions, but that's kind of how we framed this morning. And let's go sit down, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. I would also like to invite our other guests to join the discussion. So Martha, if you would like to join us. And I'm also going to introduce Greg Pasquarelli, who agreed as well to join the panel. So we're all improvising a bit, but that should be fun. So allow me also to introduce architect Greg Pasquarelli of Shop Architects from New York. He's the founding partner at Shop. Shop is a design think tank that has been a global leader in software design, real estate development, emergent construction research, and the co-development of new sustainable technologies among architecture, of course. Shop's recent work include the Barclays Center at Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn, a 2-mile esplanade and park along the East River waterfront, the Innovation Hub Government Complex in Botswana, Africa, the South Street Seaport redevelopment, a new Major League Soccer stadium in New York, and projects for Google in Mountain View, California. So thanks, Greg, for joining.
I don't know how many of you have ever seen the reconstruction of Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion in Barcelona. A lot of people admired it, a lot of people thought it was fantastic, but I just had that awful feeling that it was done by men with Gucci shoes and with, Prada socks. And I didn't like it very much. I thought it was a kind of a mockery of the Miesian spirit of architecture. So, it's a strange thing to say that there is, within the material world of architecture, a spiritual communication that for those who are looking for it is there. And I think that's, at least for myself, I can only talk for me, I can tell what is really fake, even if it is on a grand scale, and what is real, even if it is a very small and humble little building. And that's kind of why I think, these are all friends, and my wife more than a friend, but I think there are two kinds of architects who are interested in quantity and in, let's say, power, and architects who are kind of have a different sense of what and why they got involved in architecture.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Yesterday you showed quite a lot of very interesting works, and one of the things that I remember from your talk the most is really the examples where you show how one project happens with all the constraints and all the parameters, and still you find it worthy to pursue it, and then in the end it generates a lot of other urban developments around it after that. And I find this question very interesting for us, also for all the students here, to understand our role as architects in urban change, in larger urban change. And this is something we saw in all of the work yesterday, how design does matter in trying to move larger processes. So I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts.
It's a good question. I don't know if I can answer it, but I don't know how many of you have ever read the writings of Houdini. He was Jewish. He was the magician. He used to get sort of tied in chains. He actually died in one of his exploits. Tied in chains, put into water, and then tried to get out. In a way, that's architecture to me. We never get a project on a nice field with a lot of money, with kind of a glory, do something beautiful for us. You're Mr. Architect, we've got all this, represent us. We always get projects that mostly somebody else had left behind, like they couldn't solve it, they couldn't do it. It's too difficult, there's no money there. It's never going to get built. It's just a competition. Who knows what will happen to it? To me, that's the true architecture, where it seems to be hopeless, seems that nothing will ever be done, seems that there is no public will, seems that everybody has given up. That's when a project begins to be interesting to me, personally, because that's the challenge. I don't think I ever had and ever will have a project with a big budget, which somebody just said, go ahead and build me this project. And to me, that's probably true for my colleagues, that's the nature of the kind of things we do.
I agree entirely, and as like you said, Houdini died in one of his tricks. Every time I meet a client, I think, is this the one who's going to kill me?
Well, I think the challenge, certainly in our practice, and I agree with Danielle that we're very seldom given an unlimited budget. We're very seldom given a field with nothing on it. We're usually asked to do things in pretty complex political situations or complex financial situations. And most of our projects demand an enormous amount of public engagement. When we did the Royal Ontario Museum, we must have addressed tens of thousands of people who would come on a regular basis to talk about what they wanted to see there, why they didn't like the project, why they did like the project. When we did the San Francisco Jewish Museum, it was the same thing. The Jewish Museum took 12 years to build. It was a marathon, not a sprint. So many of these projects have a political element to them, and I think architecture is a very political art. whether you build a house in the middle of Connecticut, which we've just done, or whether you are building in the most complex city in the world, which is, of course, New York. These projects have a political and financial complexity to them, and one has to wend its way and solve those issues in a creative manner, and that certainly is the challenge. Not to solve them simply as A plus B equals C, but to solve them in a very unconventional, creative, unexpected way, which usually leads somebody to have an epiphany, a moment where they say, oh, that's how we can do it. And that has been our luck, really, to do a lot of our projects with that kind of spirit.
Nina, I think that's an excellent point, and I think that often architects, sometimes we hear people complain, oh, this was so difficult, this was a problem, this was a challenge. But to me, I think, and I think everyone on this stage feels the same way, that it's about engaging those issues and not to practice architecture in a kind of hermetic, sealed environment, but to understand the political, understand the financial, understand the technological, understand the construction, understanding the human spirit and how that kind of comes together, that the art of architecture is actually bringing those things together. And the more that you kind of invest in understanding the mechanisms of those events, I actually believe, and some people would say, oh, well, you're dealing with all that issue, really what we want to be is designers. And I actually think that the more you deal with those issues, the more design freedom you actually get. And the more you're solving problems and able to push the art ahead.
Well, let me just pick up. I don't want to interfere with Martha. Martha, go ahead first.
Well, no, go ahead.
I had an idea about why this has changed, and why the Bauhaus is over. Because Israel, so much of Israel is built this beautiful, this pioneer architecture that had this glorious, incredible ideological motive in it. And its beauty is part of that ideological motive which had disappeared. But I always wondered, what is the difference between now and ideologies left or right before? I mean left-wing or right-wing before, which have both fallen apart. And I think it is this, that in the previous era, 20th century, really thought in big ideological terms about the future, about the progress, about the right human values, about whatever is going to happen. They kind of, they were confident that the human thought itself would take humanity to wherever it wants to go. I think we have seen this broken. We have seen re-emergence of the pathos of the individual. We have seen liberties under threat. We have seen celebration of violence. So the world has changed, and I think this whole utopian idea of starting from zero and creating a new world with its social order and so on, this is why when I go to Tel Aviv or Haifa and I see these incredible white buildings and I think of what these great people thought about, they were brought in socialism, all the isms really were there, that these isms are not just absent, but we have had another experience across the fatality of the 20th century. We see them in the 21st century too. So something has changed. I don't know how else to say. And it has changed not just in environment, it's changed somehow in people. And I think the more this can be admitted, because it has been repressed, and particularly repressed in architecture, because architecture is the profession of power. You build something, you assert power. You build something, you assert a certain system of thought. But I think the architecture I'm interested in is the architecture that has a different character. It's not asserting this left wing, right wing of the future. It's asserting something much more human. Call it whatever you want. Whatever, quote, style you want to call it, or whatever way you want to call it, whether you want it's got more landscape or more sustainability, more greenery, or deconstruction, or whatever. It's a general term to me that signifies that people don't have this tabula rasa, let's start from zero again attitude. And that will change architecture. And I have to tell you, I was brought up, when I went to school, I'm that old, I studied with Peter Eisenman and Richard Meyer and John Haydock and all those great architects who invented, the 9 square problem, put a perfect grid, manipulate the grid with the beautiful curves. It's all about art. And they forgot, I think in retrospect, they forgot that there was money involved, and money is not evil. Money is just the way the world has always exchanged. What is the function of money? Economics, as you said, Greg. Social functions, cultural functions. What kind of world do we live in? Do we want to live in? So I'm just making this little footnote about memory because too much of architecture, in my view, is taken still as an aesthetic object. You know, do you like this building? Do you like this facade? Is it pretty enough? Do you think it should be built? Or what does the building really want to do? What kind of questions does it raise? And that's to me interesting, that people are very smart. In science, raising questions is a primary motive of the human being. To ask fundamental question, why? It has been seen like this always, but it's not true. Why is it like that? In biotechnology, in economics, people ask fundamental questions, but in architecture, people only demand answers. I think that's the pathos of this field, that architects have not managed to raise questions in the building, not verbally. Verbally, it's easy to ask a question, but shouldn't the buildings raise questions about us? Not we about the buildings, but the building should raise questions about how do we live, where do we go, who are we, what do we remember, what do we want in this life? So that's kind of an attitude that I would say, you know, I don't have a prepared talk, but just to, if I want to transmit something to young architects, it's that this sense of vulnerability is not negative. It's not something pathetic. It's not putting your head in the sand. On the contrary, it's maybe being able to go through something far more important. Sorry.
Well, that's hard. That's a hard one to follow. But I would agree to all of that as it pertains to the landscape. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the landscape and kind of where it sits in relation to architecture, because it's quite a different medium, and you know, it's actually what our medium is not typically steel and glass. It's not verticality, it's horizontality. It's earth, it's stone, it's water. However, the ability for it to do what you're saying, which is to ask questions, to be able to carry that kind of content and make connection, is absolutely necessary. That, you know, it's not just it's not a blank page that somehow happens after you put the buildings down. I mean, one of the things that one of the reasons why I always thought the minimalist artists, and I still am a minimalist, 60s minimalist fan, is that the idea there is how to make the most out of the least. And that's something that as landscape architects, we all have to think about, because the landscape typically is always so underfunded. It's not valued like buildings. It's not an object. It's the stuff that flows and connects between everything. So, and it often isn't owned by anybody in particular, or it's public. And
well, this is a good point, because, and I just want to share this view with you about Ground Zero. First of all, I want to say that at Ground Zero, at the time when the competition was held, the then mayor of New York did not want any tall buildings. He said we should not rebuild tall buildings in New York. This was a disaster. We should learn something from it. Buildings should be low in Lower Manhattan. No more skyscrapers. I didn't listen to it, neither did many other people. But what I want to say is that all the really greatest architects, my colleagues, whether it's Norman Foster or Richard Meyer or Stephen Hall or Vignoli, all the architects who participate in the competition, is concentrated on buildings. First thing was big buildings in the center of the site. And hearing what just Martha said, my idea was very, very different. Don't build on most of the site. Don't build and don't build the tallest buildings in the world, even though there is one right now, the tallest building in Western Hemisphere, but it won't be for long. But it was not my interest to build the tallest buildings in the world, but rather to concentrate on shared space in a place of such catastrophe, which was never declared something special, just a piece of real estate in New York, and every inch in New York costs millions of dollars. But I thought it's not right to build on this space because people died there. It can't just be business as usual, let's build more big buildings. And the investors certainly wanted to build in the middle of the site, actually. So it took a struggle to convince people that you don't have to build in half of the site, that you can leave it not just empty, but turn it into a civic public space badly needed in Lower Manhattan, because Lower Manhattan doesn't have a lot of public spaces. You know, Central Park is a big public space, but outside of that, New York is very poor in public spaces. So I thought this could be a good thing for the city and for people, and really an affirmation of life with the memory of that attack, and at the same time create a skyline which is really fantastic and really inspiring, symbolic in many ways. And I have to say, I said it yesterday, but I did it for very personal reasons, for two reasons. Number one, when I was in the pit, I had two promised lands. I still have two promised lands, Israel and the United States. It's two promised lands at once. When I came to America, when I was in the pit, I saw myself and my family arriving by ship on that harbor. I was one of the last immigrants to come by ship. And at that time, I actually realized that the project should not be just about buildings. It should really be about that, about liberty. That is really what architecture is about. It's not about just glass buildings, which are tall. And I thought of all the things that should be implicated in the site, which were symbolic, 1776 Freedom Tower, the Wedge of Light Plaza, the buildings standing around in a sort of a spiral, echoing the Torch of Liberty, the slurry wall, which goes all the way down and is revealed to the public as a foundation of the buildings. So I did it for personal reasons because, as I said it yesterday, my parents were workers in the sweatshops of New York. They were not university professors. Maybe they would have been university professors if the Holocaust did not happen, because I think all of those survivors, to me, were much more educated than the professors at Harvard that were next to me when I was a professor at Harvard. Really, believe me, those survivors had, well, there are great professors at Harvard, but I'm saying, those elderly survivors, like, my parents, were so smart. They had so much knowledge about philosophy, theology, metaphysics, society, the military history, and so on. But I want to just say that my parents would have never been in any of those glossy buildings, because like New Yorkers, they were in the subways, they were running to work, they were trying to support their families. They would never be anywhere in those glorious images that we see. They would be in the subways, in the PATH trains, on the streets of New York, like 99% of New Yorkers, actually. That's what I try to do. Make nice streets, make good streets, make good connections so that the subway is something beautiful. The PATH terminal is going to be something fantastic for normal people just going to work. And to me, that's somehow the essence of architecture, that it is deeply committed to social justice, but not in the ways we've seen it in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. Maybe the 80s things changed.
Daniel, would it be possible to talk a bit about more the academic setting we are in right now, and what you guys were all talking about before, the constraints of architecture? Once you start working, and what Greg said, the more constraints and the more you manage to control those constraints, the more freedom you achieve. How do you see that in teaching architecture? And it would be also great to hear a bit about your memories from Cranbrook in that respect, where...
No, I was a teacher for many years of my life. I'm still professor in some universities. I believe that schools have to change. I always believed it. That it's the most radical thing, is a school, is the most radical institution ever created in the history of the world, because you can think freely. There are no people telling you what to think, how to think, what to do. It's the true garden of freedom, the only one, because it's protected. You don't have to worry about police standing outside or inside. You can do whatever you want. And I thought, this is the great opportunity to really challenge everything. Don't take anything for granted. I'm always shocked when I go to schools how conventional the work is. It imitates what's in magazines, what's being built. But to me, to be in school is to say, no, I don't believe any of it. It's all just not true. The challenge, I mean, what comes out of it, I don't know. It's up to each individual. Each creative person has to sort of embark on that road. But I think school is a great time to take away all the shackles of convention, of habit, of so-called success, and to say, where are we today? What would I do today if, I'm alone in this world? I have all the possibilities of thought, and I have a pencil or a computer. I have some tools that I can envision something. And to me, that's, I encourage every student not to follow what's happening in exhibitions or the successful buildings that are being built. Forget about it. That's not important. I just follow kind of a spirit of investigation. Wherever it leads you, who knows? I mean, it might lead you to a dead end. There's no guarantee. It led me to some strange dead ends in my life. I started with drawing. I had no jobs. For many years, I just drew. And I didn't even draw buildings because I didn't know, what am I going to do? A castle or a school or some fantasy? No. I just drew one line on top of another line in the hallucinatory belief that somehow drawing would draw out of the piece of paper or out of the emptiness of reality something that I could follow. And strangely, it happened to me that those lines which I followed somehow materialized in reality. I don't know why. I'm not a believer in God, but it's a kind of a strange transcendent experience that you encounter something you thought was not really there. So I advise every student and every professor, because I was also a professor for many years, to take the freedom that you have. Because freedom, when you get married, when you have kids, when you have to have a job, it's much more difficult to do what I'm now saying. In a way, you're in a protected space. When you were here a little bit younger, now I have to think, how am I going to feed the family? What am I going to do? I have to make some money. But in truth, I think you can do anything. And I think the great revolutions of thought happen in young people's minds, where you can truly do something that isn't marching in step to an order. And I'm actually against order, and I'm against disorder. Really, I'm against order, and I'm against disorder. I don't like either one of those.
I just wanted to share with you two things that Daniel has done in teaching, because you were talking about the academic world. He teaches at a university in northern Germany. He teaches architecture, but he teaches in a school that has no architects. So he teaches a class of geographers and educators and mathematicians and economists and people in finance, librarians, whomever goes to the school, which is a science and humanistic university. And he teaches architecture because he wanted to discuss with people who were not architects how to empower them to discuss not only verbally and articulate architecture verbally, but how to actually encourage them to make things. And indeed, the building that they have discussed now over the course of 4 years is getting built. Now, how does that happen? It happens through talking about what kind of room would you like. This particular room is a room which has all the religions of the world praying in it, even Islam and Judaism and Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, and Buddhism will all have a multi-purpose, and they all agreed to do this. The imam, the rabbis, the priests, the ministers, the Zen masters have all agreed. So what kind of room will it be? And Daniel had an entire seminar for an entire 4-month period. What kind of room should it be? Should it be high? Should it be low? Should it have windows? If they have windows, should it be big windows? Should it be small windows? How much should it cost? Should it be intimate? Should it be open? And the students were provoked all through this time, and they came up with the answers. What kind of landscape should there be? Should it be hard landscape? Should it be soft landscape? Should there be trees? Should there be flowers? Should there be benches? Should there be whatever? And that is also being built. So I found, as a person who is not an architect, I found it very interesting that people who had absolutely no training in architecture at all were able to not only articulate but build some of the things they wanted to do. From this experience, we're now doing an online course. There are lots of online courses. What makes this course different is that there are 1,800 students around the world who are doing it for credit, and 180,000 students around the world who are auditing the course. And there are platforms. Facebook is used, Twitter is used, Tumblr is used, all the different mediums. It is extremely well controlled. It's 126 countries around the world, from Fiji to Afghanistan. It's an incredible experiment. We'll see whether it works. We don't know yet. It has different kinds of people presenting, not just Danielle. It's got economists and sociologists from every university you can imagine. But I think what Danielle is perhaps relating in terms of education is that the world has to change, and the openness of education, the ability to use these different platforms in a meaningful manner, so it's not just a passive person behind a passive screen. I think that's been a very interesting challenge. And doing architecture in this way, believing that people can be empowered because people are empowered. They have those programs on the computer, democratizes, I believe, democratizes education and democratizes architecture, which is personally what I'm quite interested in. Just thought I'd share it.
The Garden of Freedom sounds fantastic, and when we're talking about system of education, most of the people in this hall are either students or professors, so this is our reality. We're thinking about how to make this happen, right? Now, the Bauhaus was so influential, and the curriculum of this school is built on the curriculum of the Bauhaus to a great extent, because it had a method, and it had workshops, and it had a way to reach this goal that was social, that is outdated by now, but is very important. And I'm a little worried of the Garden of Freedom, because what you said and Greg related to, and you talked about the vulnerability and the idea that constraints are something that builds it up. We shouldn't be afraid of them. And I was wondering, like we had the workshop, let's say the Bauhaus, what is within this freedom? I mean, transcendence sounds so big and so on. What are the constraints in the education system that we should put? What are the challenges? How do we frame how do we get vulnerable and what we get out of it?
It's a fantastic question. It's a very profound question. Cannot easily be answered. And I know this is a very, very intelligent, this is a highly, the reason I said Garden of Freedom, because it's such a privilege. It's such a privileged point of the world to be in a place which can think, which can also do with their hands. You can draw, you can make things, you can investigate, you can make experiments. But my view is not to constrain. I think that's the difference. The Bauhaus had a socialist agenda. My wife just said I should watch it, but it had a socialist agenda. And the agenda was, we're going to build this world that's going to be available to everybody. It's about, the chair we make will be for the worker. The teapot will be for the worker. The house, unfortunately, the teapot costs $1,000. The house is $2 million. It turned out the dream had a flaw. So I am not too impressed with putting freedom into a sort of ready-made existential economic network. I'm ready to say, people are so smart. People have their own experiences. People have their own sense of limits. But people can go far. I'm not afraid that freedom will produce mediocrity. And many people think freedom is just a mess. People just do horrible things. Everybody will do the same thing, and everybody's an idiot anyway. So what's the freedom for? No, I don't believe that. I believe that knowing our own fallibility, and everybody knows that, the fallenness, everybody knows the limits. But the investigation in a university has discussion. This is the beauty of a university. There is dialogue. You're not alone. There are friends, there are colleagues, there are people who can question. And that's what I meant by questioning. I mean, to me, that is the key to architecture, actually to anything. Because if you don't question anything, you just wind up to be a bureaucrat. you know, a bureaucrat. You can be a bureaucrat of the divine, or the bureaucrat of the manager. It's the same thing to me. But if you question, I think you can penetrate to the deeper sense of understanding. It's like, you know, the book of Job. You know, he doesn't get an answer, really. You know, at the end, he doesn't get any answer at all. And that's the beauty of that book. It doesn't give an answer. It disconnects this world from the other world. And I think that's education. I'm all for the disconnection, because I think if you bring economic factors, you bring all the baggage of reality, you paralyze people from the very beginning, and nothing will ever happen, and people already start marching towards this goal, which doesn't exist anyway. So to answer your question, I'm not afraid of you know, participation. Nina mentioned democratization, but I think in the future there won't be any architects. That's actually my own personal view. I think there won't be any architects. I think everybody's going to be an architect with the right software, with the right tools, the right participatory system, which will happen. Everybody will be able to put the special angle of light into the street on which they are walking or on which they live. It's not going to be a dream. It's just, look, there used to be critics of architecture. There are no more critics. I mean, maybe in Israel there still are, but nowhere else. Because now everybody's a critic. Everybody can say what they like. There's no more critics of movies, because everybody, go on any blog there, everybody can tell you what they like and what they don't. So I think there won't be any architects.
Daniel, you might be right, Daniel, but there'll still be good architects and bad architects.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you very much, Daniel and Nina, for the discussion. We are going to take a very short break because we're a bit in delay. So I would suggest, what's the time now? 15 minutes, if possible. There are some refreshments outside, and we will continue with the lecture of Vanessa Kasabian.